My Christmas mic drop moment at Christmas, my mother-in-law Helen smugly introduced a new woman to my husband, Ethan. I just gave a sweet smile and dropped the bomb, just so everyone knows, the house is in my name, not his. The whole room just froze. My name's Chloe Emerson, and for 7 years, I was completely head over heels for Ethan Miller. We met at a crowded bar near the beach in Santa Monica right after I finished college, and I thought our connection was instant, electric, and real. 4 years into our marriage, and just 2 months ago, if you'd asked me to describe our life in San Diego, California, I would have used words like perfect, stable, and future-proof. We had the whole deal, the beautiful house, the successful careers, the shared dreams of eventually filling that house with kids. How desperately naive that sounds now. I genuinely believed we were an unbeatable team, building something beautiful and lasting together. The irony is, while I was busy planning our 10-year anniversary trip, Ethan and his mother, Helen, were busy dismantling the whole foundation. The warning signs, in hindsight, weren't even subtle. I was just too blinded by my faith in him, or maybe my own sheer busyness, to see them clearly. They'd been fluttering around for maybe 6 or 7 months, like distracting little gnats I kept swatting away. I'd attributed everything to work stress. Ethan was killing himself trying to prove his worth as a vice president at his father's boutique investment firm, Miller & Company. Investments, located in a high-rise office in downtown San Diego. Meanwhile, I was running my own hugely successful, but equally demanding, digital marketing and crisis management agency. My company, Emerson Strategies, had hit a major growth spurt, and I was spending intense hours at my home office, often plugged into conference calls with clients in New York or London. It started with the late nights. Ethan, who used to be home by 7 p.m. without fail, was suddenly claiming he needed to stay late for critical quarterly reports or unexpected client meetings in Orange County. Then came the secretive phone calls. He'd abruptly cut conversations short when I walked into the room, always murmuring, "Gotta go, call you back later." If I asked who it was, he'd give a vague answer about a colleague or a new acquisition deal. But the most obvious shift, the one that should have screamed betrayal, was his sudden, intense interest in his appearance. Ethan, who usually wore the same 3 button-down shirts on rotation, was suddenly shopping for designer jeans and getting professional haircuts every 2 weeks. He bought a new membership at a high-end gym he insisted on going to solo, claiming he needed decompression time. I should have connected those very bright dots much, much sooner. I didn't. I just thought, my husband is finally taking care of himself, good for him. The turning point was 8 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday evening, and Ethan was in the shower. I'd walked into our bedroom to grab a book when I heard the distinct ping of his phone from the nightstand. For a split second, I hesitated. I'd never snooped. I believed in the privacy of our marriage. But that persistent nagging feeling, that instinct I'd been suppressing, finally won. I picked it up. The lock screen showed a new text notification. The name was blurred out, but the message wasn't, "See you tomorrow night. Can't wait to finally meet your family. P.S. You told them we're just friends for now, right? XOXO. My hand shook so violently I nearly dropped the phone. The initials, P.S., were what made my blood run instantly, irrevocably cold. P.S. meant Helen, his mother. My mind, which usually runs at the speed of a high-power server, seized up completely. He wasn't just having an affair, his mother was involved. The woman who hated me with the fiery passion of 1,000 suns was actively facilitating his infidelity. My blood turned to ice water as I realized the full gravity of the situation. Helen Miller had never, ever liked me. From the very first moment Ethan brought me to meet his family at their sprawling, aggressively opulent estate in La Jolla, she made it devastatingly clear that I lacked the necessary pedigree, the right zip code, the generational wealth, and the quiet obedience for her precious son. She had desperately wanted him to marry Tiffany Hayes, the blonde, poised, and utterly boring daughter of another powerful family in their exclusive social circle. When Ethan, who, to his credit, was briefly a man who knew his own mind, chose me instead, a middle-class girl who'd worked 2 jobs to get through UCLA and was building her own business empire outside of the Miller family's shadow. Helen never forgave either of us. She'd spent 7 years issuing polite, cutting remarks at every holiday gathering, making me feel like an interloper. But I never, ever imagined she would stoop to this, orchestrating an affair to tear our marriage down. I didn't confront Ethan when he got out of the shower. That would have been the emotional, messy thing to do. And in a crisis, I default to strategy. My business is crisis management and reputation recovery. I know how to handle a hostile takeover. Over the next 8 weeks, I became a detective in my own marriage, cold and clinical, separating my devastating emotional pain from my strategic needs. My first move was to hire a private investigator. I needed rock-solid evidence, not just a frantic text message. I found Marcus Jones, a former NYPD detective who'd moved to San Diego and opened a discreet agency. Marcus was a pro, direct and efficient. Within 2 weeks, he confirmed my worst fears and then some. Ethan had been seeing Sierra Davies for 3 months. She was a 25-year-old, ambitious commercial real estate agent who had recently moved to the area from Boston. She was, Marcus noted clinically, exactly the type of polished, Ivy League-educated woman Helen had always wanted for her son. And according to Marcus's research, Helen had been the matchmaker. She'd introduced them at the Children's Hospital Gala, a major, black-tie event I had to skip at the last minute because a key client was facing a PR emergency. The file Marcus eventually sent me, filled with color photos and detailed time-stamped reports, was gut-wrenching, but necessary. There were pictures of Ethan and Sierra at restaurants I'd never heard of, holding hands while walking through the famous Balboa Park where he proposed to me, and even kissing in the parking garage of his office building. But the most damning, most infuriating detail was the clear evidence that Helen was actively encouraging the relationship. She wasn't just turning a blind eye, she was involved. Marcus had intel that Helen was hosting small, intimate dinner parties at the La Jolla estate where Sierra played the role of Ethan's date while I was supposedly away on business trips that Ethan had completely fabricated. Helen was meticulously auditioning my replacement. As heartbroken and physically ill as I was, I knew one thing: I am not a screamer. I am a planner. My father, a retired history professor, had taught me how to play chess when I was 7, and his favorite saying always echoed in my head: never make a move until you can see the whole board, Chloe. Emotional moves lose the game. It was time to study the board very carefully and prepare my counterattack. Secure the assets and the legal foundation. My first, most crucial move was purely practical. I reviewed every single legal document related to our marriage and assets. When we got engaged, my business attorney, Sophia Chen, a sharp-as-a-tack woman I'd known since UCLA, had insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Ethan, naturally, had been offended. I'd calmly explained to him that as a rapidly growing business owner, I needed to protect my company and personal assets in case of any disaster, and I'd convinced him it was standard practice in the business world. He eventually signed. The prenup was ironclad: what was mine remained mine, and what was his remained his, including any assets acquired before the marriage. This brought me to the most powerful card in my hand: the house. The house we lived in, that beautiful 4-bedroom contemporary colonial in a desirable San Diego neighborhood that Helen constantly used as bragging fodder for her friends, "My son lives in such a gorgeous place," was purchased entirely with my money 2 months before our wedding. I'd been firm on this. Ethan was still paying off student loans and just starting at Miller & Company, and I had a significant business profit from my first big client acquisition. So, the deed was, and remained, solely in my name. In the state of California, that made it separate property, untouchable by the divorce proceedings, regardless of what Ethan or Helen thought. 2. Document. Next, I ramped up my detective work. I documented everything with the same meticulousness I used for a high-stakes client audit. Every business expense Ethan had charged to our joint checking account that was actually a date with Sierra, every lie he told me about his whereabouts, every suspicious itemized bill. I kept our joint accounts active to maintain the illusion of normalcy, but I monitored every transaction in real time through our banking apps, meticulously screenshotting everything. I created a detailed spreadsheet, Project Clean Slate, I named it in my personal cloud drive, that would have made any forensic accountant proud. It was a clear log of financial infidelity and marital misconduct. 3. Strategic financial disengagement. Then came the strategic financial moves. Over several weeks, I quietly opened new personal checking and investment accounts at a different bank, one completely unconnected to the institutions the Miller family used. I began redirecting all my business income there, ensuring the revenue trail was clean and separate. I maintained just enough in our joint accounts to cover monthly bills and avoid any immediate suspicion from Ethan or the bank. 4. The inner circle consultation. I scheduled a private meeting with my attorney, Sophia Chin. I laid out the entire case, the affair, Helen's involvement, the PI's evidence, and my documented financial trail. Sophia, who rarely flinches, looked impressed. Chloe, you've essentially built the entire case before even serving him. The prenup is a fortress, and the house is indisputably yours. We have clear grounds for filing, and the financial trail strengthens your position for possible claims of financial misconduct. I updated my will and all my business insurance policies. I even had the locks changed and security upgraded on my separate office space downtown, where I'd been planning to move my business full-time anyway, a symbolic move of reclaiming my professional independence. But the most crucial part of my preparation was planning the perfect reveal. Helen had always insisted on hosting elaborate holiday celebrations, making them a demonstration of the Miller family's wealth and social power. Thanksgiving had been uncomfortable, Ethan was distant, and Helen kept making pointed comments about how young couples often grow apart and sometimes happiness is found in unexpected places. I endured it, knowing I needed to wait for her biggest event. Christmas Eve dinner was Helen's crown jewel, a formal, black-tie event for 30 of their closest friends, business associates, and family members. It was the largest audience, the grandest stage. When Helen called me to confirm our attendance, her voice was sickly sweet. "Oh, Emily, darling, I hope you don't mind, but I've invited a lovely young woman named Sierra to join us. She's new in town and doesn't have family nearby. You know how I hate for anyone to be alone during the holidays." The smugness in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. She truly thought she was cornering me, forcing me to watch my husband's mistress play house at her family celebration. She didn't realize she was giving me the microphone. Fan 2, San Kao Duok Thiat Lap. The week before Christmas, I went shopping, but not for gifts. I was shopping for my performance costume. I chose a stunning, custom-made emerald green silk dress that Ethan had always adored, paired with the diamond bracelet he'd given me for our first anniversary, a final, ironic gesture. I wanted to look absolutely magnificent, effortlessly chic, when their carefully constructed world came crashing down. I also made one final logistical preparation. I called my brother, Jack, who lives in Seattle, and my best friend, Olivia, an ER nurse in Los Angeles. I asked them to be on standby. I didn't tell them the full, ugly truth, but I hinted heavily that I was about to execute a high-stakes, life-altering business move and that I might need immediate emotional support right after Christmas dinner. Both promised to keep their phones close and agreed to fly down to San Diego on Christmas morning if I called. Christmas Eve arrived, crisp and clear, a typical mild San Diego winter day. Ethan was unusually attentive that morning. He brought me coffee in bed and remarked on how beautiful I looked in my casual wear. I wondered if his conscience was finally gnawing at him, or if Helen had coached him to be extra sweet before they blindsided me. We arrived at the Miller family estate, a sprawling Spanish-style mansion in La Jolla, at precisely 6:30 p.m. The house was decorated like a page from Architectural Digest, with twinkling, perfectly placed white lights and fragrant garlands draped over every surface. Helen, wearing a severe navy blue designer gown that probably cost more than my first car, greeted us at the door. "Chloe, darling, you look simply lovely," she said, giving my cheek a brittle, cold kiss that felt more like a peck from a snake. "Come in, come in. Everyone is dying to see you both." The grand living room, with its two-story vaulted ceiling and view of the Pacific, was filled with the usual suspects: Ethan's father, George, a stern man who always seemed more comfortable on the golf course than at home, his sister, Rachel, and her husband, Chris, various aunts, uncles, and cousins, and several powerful family friends I'd known for years. But sitting prominently on the Italian leather sofa next to Helen's usual spot was the young woman. I'd seen her countless times in surveillance photos, but seeing her in person was a different experience. Sierra Davies was exactly what I'd expected: tall, naturally blonde, and immaculately polished. She wore a sophisticated, cream-colored cocktail dress that was clearly expensive but appropriately modest for a family event. When she saw Ethan, her face truly lit up with a genuine, starry-eyed affection that might have broken my heart if it hadn't already been encased in ice. "Ethan!" Helen called out, her voice loud and carrying. "Come meet Sierra. I've told her so much about you." I watched my husband's performance with grudging, cynical admiration. He managed to look surprised, yet pleased, as he walked over. He shook Sierra's hand, holding it a fraction longer than necessary, his eyes conveying a subtle, intimate connection. "Sierra, what a pleasure," he said, the charm switch flipped on high. "Mom mentioned you were new in town." "Yes, I moved here from Boston about 8 months ago," Sierra replied, her voice warm and friendly, clearly trying to make a good impression. "Your mother has been so welcoming. She's told me the most wonderful things about the whole family." I stood there, smiling serenely, playing the role of the devoted, oblivious wife. While the conversation around me bubbled with forced holiday cheer, I could feel the sharp, anticipatory undercurrent in the room. Helen's closest friends, the society matrons who had always treated me with polite but dismissive disdain, were watching me with barely concealed excitement. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know I was the one holding the script. At 8 p.m., dinner was called. Helen, the master orchestrator, had clearly devised the seating arrangement to maximize the psychological impact. Ethan was positioned directly across from Sierra. I was relegated to the far end of the table, wedged between his elderly, slightly hard-of-hearing Uncle Frank and his cousin's wife, Jess, who I knew was kind-hearted and outside of Helen's drama. The conversation started innocuously, flowing around topics I'd heard 1,000 times before: George's latest golf tournament at the Torrey Pines course, Rachel's children's over-the-top accomplishments, the family's upcoming winter vacation to Aspen. But I could feel the tension building like a high-tide warning as Helen kept expertly steering the conversation back to Sierra. She didn't just talk about her, she auditioned her. Helen praised her career drive, her educational background, and her impressive family connections. Sierra graduated from Wharton Business School, Helen announced loudly during the salad course, making sure to hit every syllable. "Just like our Ethan. They have so much in common, don't they?" "How interesting," I replied smoothly, meeting Sierra's eyes across the expansive table. My tone was light, curious. Business school must have been quite the experience. I went straight from undergrad to starting my own company, so I sometimes wonder what I missed by not doing the MBA track. Sierra smiled politely, taking the bait. "Oh, there's nothing wrong with learning through experience, Chloe." "That's fantastic. Mom mentioned you have your own marketing firm." "That's right," I confirmed. "We specialize in crisis management and reputation recovery. It's truly amazing how quickly a solid reputation can be destroyed, and how much intricate, expensive work it takes to rebuild trust once it's been broken. It's a niche, but always in high demand." Ethan visibly shifted in his seat, the subtle discomfort beginning to show. But Helen, relentless, pressed on. "Sierra works in commercial real estate. She's already one of the top agents in her firm, the Gold Coast Group, and has her sights set on the big properties in Malibu. Real estate can be such a relationship-based business," I observed, picking at my salad. "Trust is absolutely everything, isn't it? Clients need to know their agent has their best interests at heart," not some hidden agenda or side deal going on. The conversation continued through the main course, a ridiculously opulent Wellington beef, with Helen becoming increasingly bold in her praise of Sierra and more pointed in her comments directed at me. She talked about young people finding their true paths and life taking unexpected, but necessary, turns. I noticed Sierra stealing glances at Ethan when she thought no one was looking. There was a genuine, innocent affection in her eyes, which almost made me feel a flicker of pity for her. She was a pawn in Helen's elaborate, cruel chess game, and she didn't even know it. "Sierra, you must tell us about your family," Helen prompted, steering toward another perfectly rehearsed talking point. "I understand your father is in finance as well." "Yes, he's a portfolio manager in Manhattan," Sierra replied, unconsciously straightening her posture. "He actually went to Wharton, too, about 20 years before Ethan did." "How wonderful!" Helen exclaimed, as if this was divine providence. "Ethan, didn't you say you were thinking about expanding the firm's investment services with a new satellite office in New York?" Ethan nodded, playing his part perfectly. "We've been considering it. It would be incredibly helpful to have someone with that kind of Manhattan background on the team." I watched, fascinated. They had clearly rehearsed this exchange to establish Sierra's pedigree and professional value to the Miller family business. "And Sierra, you mentioned you're originally from Connecticut?" George, Ethan's father, asked, apparently oblivious to his wife's deeper machinations. "That's right, Greenwich. My family has a place right on the water there. Nothing too fancy, just a little cottage we've had for generations." I nearly choked on my wine. A little cottage in Greenwich that had been in the family for generations likely cost upwards of $15 million. Helen's eyes lit up like a Times Square billboard. She hadn't just found a daughter-in-law, she'd found one with both money and generational pedigree. "How lovely," I interjected smoothly. "Greenwich is beautiful. Ethan and I looked at properties there when we first got married, but we decided we preferred being closer to the city for work purposes." It was a subtle, necessary reminder to the room that Ethan and I had made joint life decisions. Helen simply filed it away as evidence of my practical, unromantic nature. "Chloe's always been very focused on convenience over beauty," Helen said with a tight, patronizing smile. "It's admirable, really, how dedicated she is to her work." The backhanded compliment hung in the air. "I've always believed that loving what you do makes you better at everything else in life," I replied, my voice even. "When you're fulfilled professionally, you have more energy and enthusiasm to bring to your personal relationships." Sierra smiled genuinely at this. "I completely agree. I love real estate because I get to help people find their dream homes. There's something so satisfying about matching the right person with the right property." "How do you determine what makes a property right for someone?" Ethan asked, and I could hear the subtle, unmistakable flirtation in his tone, even if others might have missed it. "Well," Sierra said, warming to the topic, "you have to really listen to what they're saying, and what they're not saying. Sometimes people think they want one thing, but what they really need is something completely different." The irony was so thick I could have cut it with the sterling silver steak knife. Sierra was unknowingly describing exactly what Helen had done to her, convinced her she wanted Ethan when what she really needed was to run as far away from this manipulative family as possible. "That sounds like quite a skill," Rachel, Ethan's sister, commented. "I imagine you have to be very perceptive about people's motivations." "You do," Sierra agreed. "Unfortunately, not everyone is honest about what they want or what their situation really is. I've had clients lie about their budget, their timeline, even their relationship status. It makes the job much more challenging." Ethan went completely still at this comment, and I saw Helen's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Sierra had just unknowingly described her own situation perfectly. She was being lied to about Ethan's relationship status, his timeline, and his true, weak motivations. "Honesty is so important in any relationship," I said, looking directly at Sierra, professional or personal. "Once trust is broken, it's nearly impossible to rebuild." "Absolutely," Sierra said earnestly. I always tell my clients that we can work through almost any challenge as long as we're honest with each other from the start. The conversation was becoming surreal. Sierra kept making points that inadvertently undermined her own position, while Ethan grew more and more uncomfortable, and Helen worked harder to steer things back to safer topics. Sierra, you simply must tell us about that lovely property you sold last month, Helen interjected quickly, desperate to change the subject. The one with the gorgeous gardens. But before Sierra could answer, Uncle Frank, who had been quietly working his way through his third glass of Cabernet, spoke up, his voice loud in a temporary lull. You know, this whole real estate conversation reminds me of when I was in the business back in Palm Springs years ago. Had this client once who was married, but told everyone he was single. Caused quite a mess when the truth came out. The table fell into a profound silence, broken only by the soft clink of silverware. Frank, bless his oblivious heart, continued cheerfully. Fellow thought he was being clever, keeping his wife in the dark while he shopped for a love nest with his girlfriend. But the girlfriend found out about the wife. The wife found out about the girlfriend. And both women ended up owning pieces of him in the divorce settlement. Helen, utterly mortified, snapped sharply, perhaps we should discuss something more pleasant, Frank. Oh, it turned out quite pleasant in the end, Frank continued, completely ignoring her. The wife took him for everything he was worth. The girlfriend realized she'd dodged a bullet, and both women ended up much happier without him. Funny how these things work out sometimes. I raised my wine glass slightly in Frank's direction. To justice being served, I said quietly, but not so quietly that the entire table couldn't hear the pointed toast. Sierra looked increasingly uncomfortable, now starting to grasp the strange, hostile undercurrent. Ethan, on the other hand, looked like he was seconds away from crawling under the table. Well, Helen said, her voice bright with desperation, shall we move on to dessert? I made my famous chocolate torte. As Helen bustled around serving the rich, dark chocolate torte, I caught Jess, the cousin's wife next to me, giving me a meaningful, concerned look. She leaned over and whispered, "Are you okay, honey? You seem very controlled tonight." I smiled at her gratefully. Jess had always been kind and observant, never part of Helen's inner circle. "I'm fine," I whispered back. "Just enjoying the family dynamics." Jess studied my face, then glanced at Helen's obvious matchmaking efforts, Ethan's discomfort, and Sierra's innocent participation in the setup. A look of total understanding dawned in her eyes. "Oh my," she breathed quietly. "Do you need?" "I've got it handled," I assured her softly. "But thank you." Jess squeezed my hand under the table, a small act of solidarity that genuinely meant the world to me. The chocolate torte was, admittedly, delicious. Helen might be a master manipulator, but she was a formidable cook. I found myself savoring each bite, knowing this would likely be the last time I'd ever taste her famous dessert. "This is incredible, Mrs. Miller," Sierra said enthusiastically. "Would you ever be willing to share the recipe?" "Oh, it's a family recipe," Helen replied with false modesty and a pointed look at me. "I only share it with family members." The implication was painfully clear. Once Sierra married Ethan and I was out of the picture, she would be worthy of the precious torte recipe. "That's a shame," I said conversationally, setting down my fork. "I've been asking for that recipe for 8 years. I guess I never quite made it into the inner circle." The comment was light enough to be a joke, but pointed enough to make several people shift uncomfortably. Rachel looked mortified. George frowned at his wife. "Emily, you know that's not," Helen started, but I held up my hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "It's fine, Helen. I understand. Some things are reserved for blood relatives and future daughters-in-law." The emphasis on the word future was subtle but unmistakable, a tiny flare sent up into the tense air. Sierra looked genuinely confused, glancing between Helen and me as if trying to understand why a recipe was causing such a bizarre power struggle. It was then, watching Sierra's genuine bewilderment and seeing Helen's smug, satisfied smirk, that I realized the full extent of the cruelty. Helen wasn't just trying to humiliate me. She was using Sierra to do it, all while keeping Sierra in the dark about her true role as a temporary weapon. Sierra thought she was making friends at a nice family dinner. She had no idea she was being wielded against another woman. That realization crystallized my resolve. When Helen made her grand announcement, I would make sure Sierra understood exactly how she had been used, not to hurt her, but to free her from Helen's manipulation and Ethan's lies. And then, during dessert, it happened. Helen finally made her move. Part 3, The Great Revelation and the Legal Finale. This is Sierra, Helen announced proudly, raising her wine glass and gesturing grandly toward the blonde beside her. She delivered the line she had undoubtedly been rehearsing for weeks. "She'll be perfect for Ethan after the divorce." The words hung in the air like a lethal, invisible gas. The room went utterly silent. Uncle Frank nearly dropped his fork. Rachel gasped audibly. Even George, who had clearly not been informed of the precise nature of his wife's plan, looked stunned and deeply embarrassed. But I was ready. I calmly reached for a piece of sourdough bread, taking my time to butter it evenly while every eye in the room focused on me. I took a deliberate, measured bite, chewed slowly, and swallowed. Then I looked up, meeting Helen's triumphant gaze with my brightest, most innocent smile. "How nice," I said sweetly, turning my attention to Sierra. "Did they mention that the house Ethan and I live in, the beautiful one in San Diego that Helen loves to talk about? It's solely in my name, and according to the prenup, it's mine to keep, regardless of what happens to our marriage." Ethan went completely still, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips, the blood draining from his face as the full horror of the trap they had walked into finally hit him. He was losing everything he thought he controlled. Sierra's momentary confidence completely evaporated. She looked frantically between Helen and Ethan, confusion and fear replacing her composure. But I wasn't done, I continued, my voice conversational and friendly, directed primarily at Sierra. "I'm genuinely curious, Lily. When exactly did you and Ethan start your relationship? Was it before or after the charity gala in September where Helen conveniently introduced you?" The color drained entirely from Sierra's face. I'm not sure what you're implying, Chloe." "Oh, I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts," I corrected her gently, reaching into my purse and pulling out the slim manila folder. "Like the fact that you've been seeing my husband for 3 months. Or that you've been to dinner at the Del Frisco's Double Eagle Steakhouse 7 times together. They have excellent, high-resolution security cameras, by the way. Or that Helen has been hosting cozy little dinner parties right here where you play house while I'm supposedly out of town on fictional business." Helen's mouth opened and closed in silent outrage. "Chloe, I don't know what you think you know, but what I know." I interrupted her, pulling out a thick stack of glossy color prints from the folder. "What you know is that I have a private investigator who is very thorough in his work. Would you like to see the photos, Helen? Or should I just tell everyone about the time you told Sierra that once Ethan divorced me, she'd be living in the big house and wouldn't have to worry about money anymore because you would make sure the transfer went through?" The silence in the room was deafening, a vacuum that sucked all the holiday cheer out of the air. I could hear the slow, methodical ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the faint clink of ice in someone's water glass, the barely audible gasp from Rachel. Ethan finally found his voice, a raw, strangled whisper. "Chloe, please, let's not do this here. Let's talk privately." "Why not here, Ethan?" I asked, genuinely curious, looking him straight in the eyes. "This is precisely where your mother chose to publicly humiliate me in front of your entire family and social circle. This is where she thought she'd force me to sit quietly while she introduced my replacement. So, this seems like the perfect place to set the record completely straight." I stood up, smoothing the emerald green silk of my dress, and addressed the room like I was giving a high-stakes business presentation. "For those of you who are wondering, yes, Ethan has been having an affair. Yes, Helen orchestrated it. And yes, they've been meticulously planning to divorce me so Ethan could marry Sierra and live in what Helen calls, the big house. I turned back to Sierra, who looked utterly miserable, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. The thing is, Sierra, that big house, I bought it with my money before Ethan and I got married. And according to our prenuptial agreement, it remains mine regardless of what happens to our marriage. Sierra's voice was a barely audible whisper. Ethan told me you were separated. He said you were just waiting to make it official after the holidays, for appearance's sake. Did he also tell you about the joint bank account he's been using to pay for your dates? I pressed, my voice calm but firm. The one that I've been monitoring every transaction? Or that the business trips I've been taking that gave you time alone were entirely fictional? Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. That's enough, Chloe. Is it? I challenged. Because I don't think I've covered everything yet. Should I mention that you've been telling Sierra I'm emotionally distant and that we haven't been intimate in months? Because that's interesting, considering we were together 2 nights ago. Sierra made a small, wounded sound, staring at Ethan with genuine betrayal in her eyes. You said you were sleeping in the guest room. You said you hadn't, that you two weren't. He lied, I said simply. About a lot of things. To both of us. Helen finally found her voice again, which came out as a high-pitched, furious screech. How dare you come into my home and make these scandalous accusations? Liam deserves better than someone who cares more about a soulless business than her own marriage. You're absolutely right, Helen, I agreed, nodding calmly. Ethan does deserve better. He deserves someone who is honest with him. Someone who doesn't orchestrate affairs behind his back. Someone who doesn't manipulate him into betraying his wife. I looked around the room at the shocked faces of people who had known me for 7 years. For those of you who are wondering what happens now, I've already prepared and signed the divorce papers. They will be filed tomorrow morning, but I wanted everyone here to know the truth first. Marie, the cousin's wife, reached over and squeezed my hand. Chloe, honey, I'm so sorry. Thank you, I said genuinely. I appreciate that. And I want everyone to know that this wasn't a decision I made lightly. I truly tried to save my marriage. I tried to figure out what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed as a wife. I looked directly at Ethan, who was staring fixedly at his plate like it might offer him an escape route. But then I realized the truth, I hadn't failed at anything. I'd been loyal, supportive, and loving for 7 years. I built a successful business while supporting his career and trying to build relationships with his hostile family. Helen started to object again, but I held up my hand, stopping her with a look. I'm not done. You see, the thing about having your own business in crisis management is that you learn to plan for every single contingency. So, while Ethan and Helen were planning his new life with Sierra, I was planning mine. I reached into my folder and pulled out the thick stack of financial documents. These are copies of every transaction Ethan made using our joint accounts for his dates with Sierra. Restaurants, expensive gifts, even the hotel room you two used last weekend while I was supposedly visiting my sister in San Francisco. Sierra buried her face in her hands. Ethan looked like he was going to be physically ill. The total comes to approximately $12,000 over 3 months, I continued, my voice firm and businesslike. Which, according to our prenup, constitutes financial infidelity and gives me grounds to pursue additional damages. George, Ethan's father, finally spoke up, his voice gruff with absolute embarrassment. Chloe, perhaps we should discuss this privately. Please. With respect, George, there's nothing private about it anymore, I replied calmly. Your wife made absolutely sure of that when she invited Sierra here tonight to publicly humiliate me. I turned to Sierra one final time. I don't blame you entirely, Sierra. Ethan is very charming when he wants to be, and Helen can be incredibly convincing. But you should know that the man you thought you were in love with has been lying to both of us. Sierra looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I really thought. Ethan said you two were already separated. Helen showed me pictures of him looking miserable and said you were cold and career-obsessed. I'm sure she did, I replied gently. Helen has never approved of me. But Sierra, think about this. If Ethan was willing to lie to me for 5 months, use our joint money to wine and dine you, and let his mother orchestrate an affair rather than having an honest conversation with his wife about problems in our marriage, what does that tell you about his character? The room was so quiet I could hear the furnace kicking on in the basement. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. Chloe, I don't know what to say. I had absolutely no idea any of this was happening. I know, I said, my voice softer now. Most of you didn't. And I don't hold that against anyone, but I needed you all to know the truth before you started hearing Helen's highly creative version of events. I gathered my purse and my folder, preparing to leave. The divorce will be final in 2 months, as per the terms we agreed to. Ethan can stay in the house until then, but after that, he'll need to find somewhere else to live. I'll be moving my business to my downtown office full-time, so I won't be working from home anymore. Ethan finally looked up at me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flash of the insecure, slightly lost man I'd fallen in love with 7 years ago. Chloe, please. Can't we talk about this? Can't we try to work it out? Work what out, Ethan? I asked, my voice holding no anger, only exhausted finality. The lies? The cheating? The fact that your mother has been actively sabotaging our marriage for 5 months while you went along with it. He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up my hand again. Actually, don't answer that. Because here's what I've realized over the past few weeks, I don't want to work it out. I don't want to be married to someone who solves problems by having affairs. I don't want to be part of a family that thinks public humiliation is an acceptable form of holiday entertainment. I looked around the room one last time. To those of you who have been kind to me over the years, thank you. I'll miss you. To those of you who haven't, well, I won't. As I headed toward the door, Sierra called out behind me. Chloe, wait. I turned back to see her standing, her face pale but determined. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never would have done this if I'd known he was lying. I believe you, I said honestly. But Sierra, you need to ask yourself why Helen was so eager to break up her son's marriage. And you need to ask Ethan why he was so willing to let her do it. Helen stood up then, her face flushed with a mixture of anger, defeat, and utter embarrassment. You self-righteous little. George's voice cut through his wife's rage like a whip. Sit down, Helen. You've done enough. Immediately. I smiled at George, a final, genuine thank you for his 7 years of awkward, silent kindness. Thank you, George. I'll always be grateful for that. And then I walked out of the Miller family home for the last time, into the cool San Diego night air. Part 4, Aftermath and Reconstruction. The next morning, Christmas Day, my phone rang at 7 a.m. It was an unfamiliar number. Hello. Chloe. Hi. It's Sierra Davies. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number from, well, Ethan had it in his phone. It's fine, Sierra, I said, genuinely surprised. What can I do for you? I ended it, she said simply. Last night after you left. I told Ethan I couldn't be with someone who could lie so easily, so casually, to someone he claimed to love and live with. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. I know you cared about him. I thought I did, she admitted. But you were right. If he could lie to you for 5 months, what was he doing to me? And Helen. Sierra's voice trailed off into a heavy sigh. What about Helen? She called me last night after I got home, Sierra continued, a slight tremble in her voice. She was absolutely furious that I'd ruined everything by ending it with Ethan. She said I was, just like you, too independent, too difficult, too smart for my own good. She said I'd never find another man as good as Ethan. I couldn't help but let out a small, tired laugh. Well, that's Helen for you, completely predictable. The thing is, Sierra went on, I realized something while she was screaming at me. She didn't care about Ethan's happiness, or mine, or yours. She just wanted to win. She wanted to prove she could break up your marriage and control her son's life. That's exactly right, I confirmed. I was never the problem, Sierra. You wouldn't have been the solution. Helen just wanted to be in charge of the narrative and the money. We talked for another 15 minutes, a surreal, strangely intimate conversation between two women who had been manipulated by the same man and his mother. Sierra told me she was seriously considering moving back to Boston, that the whole experience had left her feeling manipulated and used. I found myself giving her the kind of advice I give my clients: trust your instincts, rebuild your reputation, and don't let other people define your worth. It was deeply strange, bonding with my husband's mistress over how we'd both been pawns in Helen's game. The divorce proceedings went exactly as Sophia Chen had predicted. Ethan didn't contest anything. He couldn't. The evidence, the PI reports, the photos, the meticulously documented financial transactions, was overwhelming. The prenuptial agreement was an insurmountable wall. The house remained mine, along with my business and all my personal assets. Ethan kept his share of our joint savings and his personal belongings. The whole thing was finalized in just under 3 months. 2 months after the divorce was final, I ran into Rachel, Ethan's sister, at a high-end grocery store in Del March. She looked terribly embarrassed when she saw me, but I smiled and approached her anyway. "How are you doing, Rachel?" I'm so sorry, Chloe. About everything. About Christmas dinner, about Mom, about Ethan. I truly had no idea any of that was happening." "I know you didn't," I said, honestly. "How is Ethan?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "He moved in with Mom and Dad temporarily. He's been pretty miserable, actually. I think he's finally starting to realize the value of what he lost. He's alone." "And Helen?" Rachel actually laughed, though it sounded painful. "Oh, she's been telling everyone who will listen that you trapped Ethan with a prenup and that you seduced him away from his true love, Sierra, with your money. Most people aren't buying it, especially after Sierra left town and told her side of the story to several mutual friends." "Sierra left?" "Yeah, about a month ago. But before she did, she had lunch with several of the women who were at Christmas dinner. She told them everything, how Mom had manipulated her, how Ethan had lied to her, and how she felt used by both of them. She basically confirmed your entire narrative." I felt a surge of respect for Sierra. It took immense courage to admit you'd been fooled, and even more courage to set the record straight in a gossipy social circle. "I'm glad she found her voice," I said. "Chloe," Rachel said hesitantly. "I know this is probably too little, too late, but I want you to know that some of us never agreed with how Mom treated you. We didn't know how to stand up to her without causing a total family war." "I understand," I said. "Helen was a formidable force who'd ruled her family through manipulation and emotional blackmail for decades. But maybe it's time someone did cause a war." Rachel smiled ruefully. "Actually, Dad's been giving her a pretty hard time about the whole thing. He was mortified by her behavior at Christmas dinner and the way George Miller and company became the talk of the country club. They're actually in marriage counseling now. Separately. 6 months after the divorce was final, I received an unexpected visitor at my new downtown office space. Ethan stood in the waiting room, looking older and incredibly tired, holding a small bouquet of generic grocery store flowers. "I know I don't have the right to be here, Chloe," he said when my assistant showed him into my sleek, modern office. "But I needed to apologize. In person." I gestured to the chair across from my glass desk. "Okay, I'm listening." He sat down heavily, placing the flowers on the edge of the desk. "I've been going to therapy. Individual therapy, not the couples counseling Mom suggested. And I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what I did to you, to us." "And what conclusion did you reach?" "That I'm a coward," he said simply, looking me straight in the eyes. "That I let my mother manipulate me into destroying the best thing that ever happened to me. That I was too weak to stand up to her, and too selfish to be honest with you." I studied his face, looking for signs of the man I'd once loved. "Why, Ethan? Why didn't you just talk to me if you were unhappy in the marriage?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from 100 less important arguments. "Because I wasn't unhappy with you, Chloe. I was unhappy with myself. With my job, with feeling like I was living in your shadow, with never being able to measure up to your success and your drive." "So, you had an affair." "So, I had an affair," he agreed miserably. "And I let Mom convince me it was your fault for being too ambitious, too independent, too focused on work." "But none of that was true," I stated. "No, it wasn't. It was all projection. I was the one who was too focused on work, on trying to prove myself to Dad, on trying to make enough money to feel like I deserved you and the life you gave us." We sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, I spoke. "I would have supported you if you'd wanted to change careers, Ethan. You know I would have helped you do something that made you genuinely happier." "I know," he said quietly. "I know that now. But at the time, I couldn't see past my own toxic insecurities. And Mom was so good at feeding them, at making me feel justified in my resentment. What do you want from me, Ethan?" He looked up at me, his eyes now genuinely wet. "Forgiveness. Closure. A second chance, to tell you that I know what I lost. To tell you that Sierra wasn't better than you. No one could be better than you. I want you to know that the biggest mistake of my life wasn't the affair. It was not appreciating what I had when I had it. And I want you to be happy, Chloe. Really happy with someone who deserves you." It was the most honest, heartfelt thing he had said to me in years. "Thank you," I said finally. "I appreciate you coming here and saying that. Truly." He nodded, stood to leave, and at the door, he turned back one more time. "For what it's worth, Chloe, you were magnificent that night at Christmas dinner. I've never seen anyone handle themselves with such total, quiet grace under pressure." After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time, thinking about forgiveness and closure and the strange, unexpected way life can sometimes come full circle. A year later, I was dating a wonderful man named Daniel Parker. He was the older brother of Marcus Jones, the private investigator, and a highly respected pediatric surgeon at a major hospital. Daniel found my independence attractive, not threatening, fully supported my business ambitions, and thought my story about the Christmas dinner mic drop was hilarious, not embarrassing. We were having dinner at Romano's, a lovely Italian restaurant in the Gaslamp Quarter, the very same place where I had organized all the surveillance photos of Ethan and Sierra, when Daniel asked me if I ever regretted how I'd handled the situation. "Do you mean, do I regret planning it out instead of just screaming and throwing things?" I asked, a slight smile on my face. "I mean, do you regret exposing everything in front of his whole family instead of handling it privately?" I considered the question seriously, twirling my wine glass. "No," I said finally. "Helen chose to humiliate me publicly. She thought she could corner me, embarrass me, and force me to accept her son's infidelity quietly. She thought I was weak. And I proved her, and Ethan, wrong. I proved that actions have consequences, that manipulating people's lives for sport comes with a very public price, and that underestimating someone because you think they're beneath you is the most dangerous game you can play." Daniel smiled and raised his wine glass. "To dangerous women and the men smart enough to appreciate them." "To second chances," I countered, clinking my glass against his, "and to the wisdom to know when someone deserves one." As we left the restaurant that night, I thought about Sierra, who had moved back to Boston and was reportedly doing extremely well in commercial real estate, completely free of the Miller drama. I thought about Ethan, who had left his father's firm to teach high school math in a public school in Chula Vista and seemed genuinely happier and more grounded. I thought about Helen, who had essentially lost her position as the family matriarch after her behavior at Christmas dinner had finally convinced George to demand serious change in their marriage. But mostly, I thought about myself, about the woman who had sat at that dinner table a year ago, calmly buttering her roll while her world exploded around her. She had been strong, strategic, and ultimately victorious. She had also been absolutely terrified. The truth was, walking away from a 7-year marriage, even a broken one, had been the hardest thing I'd ever done. Standing up to Helen in front of all those people had taken every ounce of courage I possessed. Planning my revenge had been empowering, but executing it had been terrifying. But sometimes being terrified is exactly what you need to discover how resilient and strong you truly are. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's simply getting out and starting a better life that they can only watch from afar.